She stepped into an elevator at 11 on a warm January night, and the world watched her disappear into something it still can't explain. This is a true story. My name is Julian Cross, and tonight I'm opening a file that has troubled me for years. A file that asks a question every investigator dreads. When does tragedy end and mystery begin? If cases like this keep you awake, if you find yourself drawn to the shadows where facts blur into fear, then stay with me. We're trying to reach 100 subscribers, 100 people who understand that some stories demand to be told, even when the answers refuse to come. Subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear may change how you see the ordinary spaces around you. Before we begin, I want to know something. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. What city, what country, what corner of the world has led you here tonight? I want to know how far these stories travel, how many of us are drawn to the same dark questions at the same dark hour. Now, let me take you back to January of 2013, to a city of angels that has always harbored demons, to a building where the walls remember too much. Downtown Los Angeles, Skid Row, a place where the American dream goes to fray at its edges, where the desperate and the dispossessed gather in streets that smell of exhaust and resignation. Rising from this landscape of human struggle stands a building that has witnessed nearly a century of tragedy. It was called the Cecil Hotel, though by 2013 it had rebranded as Stay on Main, as if a new name could erase the blood that had soaked into its history. 13 floors of budget rooms, worn carpets and corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should. A place where travelers on tight budgets crossed paths with those who had nowhere else to go. The Cecil had a reputation, whispered about in true crime circles, documented in police reports that stretched back decades. In the 1920s and 30s, it had been a respectable establishment. But as the neighborhood declined, so did the hotel. By the 50s and 60s, it had become a place where people came to disappear. Some left, some never did. The bodies found in rooms, on sidewalks below open windows, told stories of despair and violence. 2 notorious individuals had stayed there during their active periods. Richard Ramirez, who terrorized California in the mid-80s, had rented a room on the 14th floor, walking past guests with blood still under his fingernails. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian writer celebrated for his rehabilitation from convicted criminal to journalist, had stayed there in the early 90s while working on a story about the city. It was later discovered he had taken the lives of 3 women during that visit, adding their names to a list that already bore 9 others across 2 continents. The hotel was not cursed, though many would come to call it that. It was simply a place where poverty, mental illness, and violence converged, where society's failures became someone's final address. By 2013, the Cecil was trying to reinvent itself, offering hostel-style accommodations alongside traditional rooms, painting over the past with the hopeful language of budget travel websites. But a building remembers, and in January it would have one more name to add to its ledger. Her name was Elisa Lam, and she was 21 years old when she arrived in Los Angeles. 21, an age that should promise beginnings, not endings. She had been born in Vancouver, Canada, the daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong who had built a life through hard work and quiet perseverance. She was a student at the University of British Columbia, studying, dreaming, navigating the complex landscape of young adulthood. But Elisa carried something with her that made that navigation more difficult than it might have been for others. She had bipolar disorder, a condition that could send her soaring into manic heights or plunging into depressive depths, a condition that she wrote about openly on her blog, trying to make sense of her own mind, trying to assert her independence despite the challenges. In late January of 2013, Elisa embarked on a solo trip down the California coast. She wanted to visit San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Cruz. She wanted to prove to herself, and perhaps to her worried parents, that she could travel alone, that she could manage her condition, that she was more than her diagnosis. She documented her plans online, posting about the places she would see, the adventures she would have. There was excitement in her words, and vulnerability too. She was open about taking multiple medications, about the daily work of keeping herself balanced. On January 28, 2013, Elisa Lam checked into the Cecil Hotel. She had booked a shared hostel room. The budget option, a choice that spoke to practical travel planning and perhaps to a desire to meet other young travelers. The hotel staff would later remember her as polite, quiet, friendly. She seemed like so many other young tourists passing through, camera around her neck, guidebook in her bag, eyes bright with the possibilities of a city she'd never seen before. For the first few days, she explored. She visited bookstores. She walked through neighborhoods where street art bloomed on concrete walls. She took photographs. She updated her social media, sharing images and thoughts, staying connected to the friends and family back home who were following her journey. Her parents spoke with her regularly. Everything seemed fine, more than fine. She seemed happy. But somewhere in those first days, something shifted. Hotel guests who had shared the hostel room with her began to complain. They said her belongings were scattered, spreading into communal space. They said her behavior had become odd, unsettling in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The hotel management made a decision, moving Elisa from the shared room into a private one. It seemed like a reasonable solution to a minor problem. No one recognized it as a warning sign. No one could have known. January 31st, 2013. The last day anyone can definitively say they saw Elisa Lam. Hotel employees remember seeing her in the lobby and the halls, going about the ordinary business of being a guest in a building full of strangers. And then, as the day turned to night and night turned to the early hours of February 1st, she vanished. Not in some dramatic fashion, not with screams or struggle. She simply stopped being seen. When Elisa didn't check out as scheduled, when she stopped answering calls and messages, when the careful routine of daily contact with her parents was suddenly broken, alarms began to sound thousands of miles away. Her parents, David and Elisa Lam, knew something was wrong. They knew their daughter's patterns, her reliability, the discipline she maintained to manage her health. On February 1st, they reported her missing to the Los Angeles Police Department. The LAPD Missing Persons Unit began their work. Officers canvassed the hotel, interviewing staff and guests. They searched Elisa's room, finding her personal belongings still there, her luggage untouched, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. They reviewed the hotel's security camera footage, looking for the moment she left, trying to trace her path out into the city. And in that footage, they found something that would eventually become the most viewed piece of evidence in the case, the image that would burn itself into the public consciousness and refuse to let go. If you're still with me, if this story has its hooks in you, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to enter the heart of the mystery, the moment that transformed a missing person case into something that feels like it belongs in a different kind of story altogether. The footage is from an elevator security camera, date-stamped and time-stamped, 4 minutes of silent film that launched 1,000 theories. The elevator is small industrial, the kind found in older buildings, with buttons that glow weakly and walls that have seen better decades. The doors open and Elisa Lam steps inside. She's wearing a red hoodie over a grey shirt, black pants, sandals. Her hair is dark, long, pulled back. She enters the elevator and immediately moves to the control panel, pressing multiple buttons, more buttons than one person going to one floor would ever need. Then she steps back and positions herself in the corner, in the angle where the two walls meet, pressed into the space as if trying to make herself smaller, harder to see. The elevator doors remain open. They should have closed by now, should have carried her up or down to whatever floor she selected, but they stay open, a bright rectangular portal looking out onto an empty hallway. Seconds pass. Elisa peers around the edge of the elevator frame, looking out into the corridor, looking at something or for something the camera cannot see. Then she steps out of the elevator entirely, standing just outside, still visible to the camera. She moves strangely, checking to her left, to her right, stepping back into the elevator, then out again. Her body language is difficult to read. Is she playing, hiding, fleeing? The gestures seem both purposeful and disorganized, as if she's responding to a logic that exists only in her mind. She re-enters the elevator and presses more buttons, many more buttons, her hand moving across the panel in a pattern that seems almost frantic. Then she steps to the side of the elevator, positioning herself in the corner again, still visible from the hallway but tucked away from immediate view. She waits. The doors remain open. More seconds pass, and Elisa steps out into the hallway again. This time her movements become even stranger. She raises her hands, gesturing at the empty air, fingers moving in ways that some viewers would later describe as sign language, others as random motion, others as something ritualistic. Her body sways slightly. She seems to be talking, though the camera captures no sound, her lips moving in conversation with someone or something that isn't there, or that the camera cannot see. Then, as abruptly as it all began, she walks out of the frame, moving down the hallway to the left out of the camera's view. The elevator doors, which have remained open for this entire strange performance, finally close. The timestamp continues to run. The empty elevator sits there, waiting, revealing nothing more. 4 minutes of footage that the LAPD released to the public on February 13th, 2013, hoping that someone might recognize Elisa, might have seen her after this moment, might know where she went. The police didn't release the video to spark a mystery. They released it to find a missing woman. But what they unleashed was something else entirely. The video went viral. Millions of views in a matter of days, spreading across platforms, dissected frame by amateur detectives and conspiracy theorists, and people who simply couldn't look away. Everyone had a theory. She was fleeing from someone in the hallway, someone just out of frame who was pursuing her, threatening her, controlling her movements. She was experiencing a psychotic break, hallucinating threats or presences that only she could perceive, her gestures and hiding attempts responses to delusions. She was being attacked by something supernatural, a ghost or demon that haunted the Cecil Hotel, using the elevator as a portal between worlds. She was playing some kind of game, perhaps something she'd seen online, perhaps a challenge or an attempt to create mysterious content for her blog. The theories multiplied faster than facts could contain them. But while the internet theorized, while millions watched and re-watched those 4 minutes of security footage, Elisa Lam was somewhere else, somewhere the cameras couldn't see, somewhere that would shock the entire city when it was finally revealed. February 19th, 2013, 18 days after Elisa was last seen. Hotel guests had been complaining for days about the water. It came out of the taps with low pressure, discolored, tasting strange. Some guests reported it was black, others said brown. People were showering in it, drinking it, brushing their teeth with it, growing increasingly concerned about what was wrong with the building's plumbing. The hotel management finally sent a maintenance worker up to the roof to check the water tanks. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was not supposed to be accessible to guests. The access door was locked. The hotel claimed it was also alarmed, though later questions would arise about whether that alarm actually functioned, whether it had been triggered at any point, whether anyone had checked. The roof itself was a flat expanse of concrete, tar, and mechanical equipment, the unglamorous infrastructure of an aging building. And sitting on concrete platforms were 4 large cylindrical water tanks, each one holding thousands of gallons, each one supplying the building below with the water its occupants needed to live. The maintenance worker climbed up to inspect the tanks. He used a ladder, a portable ladder that had to be positioned against the tank's side because these structures had no built-in rungs, no easy way to reach the top. He climbed up and looked into the first tank through the access hatch at the top. Nothing unusual. He moved to the second tank. Nothing. The third tank. And then the fourth. He found her floating face up in the water, her body naked, her clothes drifting separately in the dark liquid, her skin pale from days of submersion, her eyes open to the sky she could no longer see. Elisa Lam had been in that water tank for more than 2 weeks, while guests' floors below had been bathing in water that had passed around her body, while the hotel had continued to operate, while millions of people online had watched elevator footage and speculated about her fate. If you need to pause this video, I understand, take a moment, but come back, because what happens next matters. The investigation that followed, the questions that were asked and the questions that were not asked, the official conclusions that satisfied no one, these things matter if we're going to understand why this case still haunts us. The Los Angeles Fire Department was called. They had to drain the tank to recover the body, a process that took hours. Thousands of gallons of water flowing out onto the roof and down drains, while Elisa's body slowly descended to the bottom of the tank as the water level dropped. The scene was photographed, documented, treated as any unexpected passing would be. The tank lid, the heavy metal cover that was supposed to seal the tank, had been found open when the maintenance worker looked in. Or had it been closed and he opened it? This detail, like so many others, would become contested, the early reports unclear, the official documentation apparently incomplete. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office took custody of Elisa's body and began the careful work of determining what had happened to her. The external examination revealed no obvious trauma, no broken bones, no bruises consistent with a struggle or an assault, no defensive wounds on her hands or arms suggesting she had fought someone off, no signs that anyone had struck her, strangled her, or harmed her in ways that leave physical evidence. The internal examination similarly revealed no injuries, no damage to organs, no internal bleeding. Her body showed the effects of being submerged for an extended period, but nothing that suggested violence at the hands of another person. The toxicology testing took weeks, as it always does, the careful chemical analysis of blood and tissue, looking for substances that might explain what happened. The results showed some of Elisa's prescribed medications in her system, but at levels that suggested she hadn't been taking them consistently. She was supposed to be on a regimen that included mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, medications designed to keep the bipolar disorder in check, to prevent the manic episodes and depressive crashes that could endanger her. But the levels were lower than they should have been, indicating partial compliance at best, suggesting that in the days or weeks before her passing, she had been skipping doses, perhaps believing she didn't need them, perhaps unable to maintain the routine while traveling, perhaps experiencing the very condition that the medications were meant to prevent. The toxicology found no recreational substances, no alcohol in significant amounts, no evidence of anything being forced into her system against her will. This was important, because if someone had harmed Elisa, if someone had drugged her or poisoned her or incapacitated her, the toxicology would likely have revealed it. Its absence didn't prove she was alone when she reached the water tank, but it made the theory of intentional harm much harder to support. On June 20th, 2013, nearly 4 months after Elisa's body was found, the Los Angeles County Coroner issued the final report. Cause of passing, accidental drowning. Significant condition, bipolar disorder. The report concluded that Elisa had likely entered the water tank herself during a mental health crisis, that her behavior in the elevator footage was consistent with psychosis or severe manic episode, that she had then somehow made her way to the roof, climbed up to the water tank, opened the lid, entered the water, and subsequently drowned. The manner of passing was listed as accidental. No one was charged. No criminal investigation continued. As far as the official record was concerned, this was a tragedy but not a crime, and that's when the real controversy began. Because the official explanation, while tidy on paper, left enormous questions unanswered. Questions that anyone who looked at the facts could see, questions that investigators seemed to dismiss or ignore, questions that made the public conclusion feel incomplete at best, actively deceptive at worst. How did Elisa reach the roof? The hotel maintained that the access door was locked and alarmed. If that was true, if that security was functioning as claimed, then she couldn't have simply walked up a stairwell and pushed open a door. She would have needed a key, or the alarm would have sounded and security would have responded, or the logs would have shown when the door was opened. But there's no record of any of that. So either the security claims were exaggerated, or Elisa found another route. Some investigators suggested fire escapes, external stairways that could be accessed from certain windows, routes that a determined or disoriented person might use. This is plausible. It weakens the hotel's claims about roof security, but doesn't solve the larger mystery. Even if we accept that Elisa reached the roof through some combination of failing security and accessible fire escapes, we then face the water tank itself. These tanks sat on platforms. They had no ladders built into their structure. A person wanting to reach the top would need to position a portable ladder, the kind the maintenance worker used, which would have been stored elsewhere on the roof. Could Elisa, in the midst of a mental health crisis, have found this ladder, positioned it correctly and climbed up? Possibly. It's not impossible. But it adds a layer of purposeful action that seems at odds with the disorganized, fearful behavior seen in the elevator. And then there's the lid. The tank lid was heavy, according to hotel staff who regularly serviced these tanks. It required significant force to open and close. Some accounts say it weighed 20 pounds, others say more. Could a young woman weighing approximately 115 pounds, potentially in the grip of psychosis, have opened this lid? Again, possibly. Adrenaline does remarkable things. Manic episodes can produce feats of strength and determination that seem impossible under normal circumstances. But then, after climbing in, how did the lid end up closed or mostly closed? If she pulled it shut behind her, why would she do that? If it fell closed from its own weight, was the mechanism designed that way? These technical details were never fully explained in public reports, leaving room for doubt. And what about her clothes? Her body was found naked with her clothing floating separately in the tank. Did she remove her clothing before entering the water? After? The coroner's report doesn't specify. Removing clothing can be a sign of paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon sometimes seen in hypothermia, though the water temperature in a Los Angeles rooftop tank in January wouldn't typically cause hypothermia. Or it can be a behavior associated with certain states of psychosis or mania, or it can be evidence of something else entirely. Without clear documentation of the sequence, we're left to speculate. The investigation, such as it was publicly revealed, seemed to move quickly to the accidental conclusion without thoroughly exploring these contradictions. Perhaps the detectives had answers to all these questions, answers contained in reports not released to the public. Or perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they saw a young woman with a serious mental illness, saw behavior consistent with psychosis in the elevator footage, saw an absence of evidence pointing to anyone else, and concluded that the simplest explanation, however improbable some details might seem, was the correct one. But simplicity is not the same as truth, and the public, watching from a distance, saw those gaps and filled them with theories of their own. The internet had already been obsessing over this case since the elevator video was released. Now, with Elisa's body found in such a bizarre location, with so many questions unanswered, the theories exploded. Let me walk you through them, not because I necessarily believe them, but because understanding what people thought and why they thought it tells us something important about this case and about ourselves. The foul play theory argued that someone at the hotel, or someone who had access to the hotel, had harmed Elisa. Perhaps a staff member, perhaps another guest, perhaps someone who had followed her from the street. This person had somehow incapacitated her, carried her to the roof, placed her in the water tank, and then vanished without leaving physical evidence. Proponents of this theory pointed to the Cecil's history of violence, to the rough neighborhood surrounding it, to the difficulty of imagining Elisa completing all those actions herself. They questioned why there were no security cameras on the roof, no footage showing who went up there and when. They noted that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. But here's what the foul play theory has to overcome: the complete lack of trauma on Elisa's body. If someone overpowered her, there should be signs. If someone drugged her, it should show in toxicology. If someone carried her to the roof and lifted her into the tank, there should be trace evidence, fibers, DNA, something connecting another person to the scene. The investigation found none of that, which means either the person who did this was incredibly careful, forensically sophisticated, and lucky enough to leave no evidence whatsoever, or there was no such person. The hotel negligence theory is more compelling to me. This argument doesn't require a villain, just a failure of systems. It says that the Cecil Hotel, operating in a challenging area, catering to a vulnerable population, did not have adequate security or welfare check procedures in place. That if Elisa was having a mental health crisis serious enough to be visible to other guests, serious enough to get her moved to a private room, then the hotel should have contacted authorities or her emergency contacts rather than simply relocating her. That the roof access should have been truly secured if it contained large open water tanks that could become hazards. that a building providing water to its guests should have more frequent inspections of those water supply tanks. This theory frames what happened as preventable, as a death that resulted from institutional indifference rather than from malice or the supernatural. There's weight to this. The hotel was later sued by Elisa's family, though the case was eventually dismissed. And then there's the paranormal theory, the one that gained the most traction in certain corners of the internet, the one that turned Elisa Lam's passing into something resembling an urban legend. This theory starts with the Cecil's history and builds from there. The hotel had been home to serial offenders, to dozens of tragic passings, to violence and despair accumulating over decades. What if, the theory asks, all that negative energy had created something, attracted something, opened some kind of door to forces we don't understand? What if Elisa was sensitive to these forces, was targeted by them, was being pursued by something in that elevator that the camera couldn't capture? What if her strange gestures were attempts to ward off a spiritual attack? What if she was driven to the roof and into that tank by an entity that feeds on fear and tragedy? This theory gained additional fuel from bizarre coincidences that online researchers uncovered. There was a horror movie from 2005 called Dark Water, in which a young girl's body is found in a rooftop water tank, causing water contamination in the building below. Elisa's middle name was Lam, and Lam Elisa is an anagram of is a male, which some pointed to as evidence of something, though what exactly was never clear. There was a medical test called the Lam Elisa test, used to diagnose tuberculosis, and there had been a tuberculosis outbreak on Skid Row, not far from the hotel. These connections, thin as they were, wove together in the minds of people looking for patterns, looking for meaning in the chaos. I'll tell you what I think about the paranormal theory, and I say this with respect to those who believe differently. The world contains enough real horror without inventing supernatural causes. The Cecil Hotel's reputation was not the result of a curse. It was the result of poverty, mental illness, addiction, and a society that warehouses its most vulnerable people in places like Skid Row, and then acts surprised when tragedy occurs. Buildings aren't evil. People, systems, and circumstances create harm, and coincidences, no matter how eerie they seem, are just the human pattern recognition system working overtime. But I understand why people reach for supernatural explanations, because the alternative, the reality that a young woman in crisis could reach a roof, climb into a water tank, and drown while a building full of people went about their lives unaware, the reality that such a death could be ruled accidental and the case simply closed, feels unacceptable. It feels like there should be more. More investigation, more accountability, more meaning. The paranormal theory offers a kind of meaning, even if that meaning is dark. It says this wasn't random, it wasn't meaningless. It was part of a larger pattern, a cosmic horror that at least has the dignity of being intentional. But Elisa Lam deserves better than to have her passing turned into entertainment or mythology. She deserves to be understood as a real person who struggled with a real illness, and who in the end lost that struggle in a way that could have possibly been prevented. Let's talk about bipolar disorder, because I think much of the public confusion about this case stems from misunderstanding what this condition actually is and what it can do. Bipolar disorder is not simply mood swings. It's not being happy one day and sad the next. It's a serious mental illness characterized by episodes of mania and depression that can be severe, debilitating, and dangerous. During a manic episode, a person might experience elevated mood, decreased need for sleep, increased risk-taking behavior, rapid speech, racing thoughts, and in severe cases, psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, a complete break from reality. During a depressive episode, the opposite occurs: profound sadness, loss of interest in life, fatigue, sometimes thoughts of self-harm. The condition is manageable with proper treatment, typically a combination of medication and therapy. But management requires consistency, compliance, stability, and traveling alone, away from support systems. Dealing with the stress and disruption of unfamiliar environments can make that management much harder. If Elisa was not taking her medications consistently, if she was entering a manic phase, then the behavior we see in that elevator footage makes perfect sense. The paranoia, the hiding, the response to stimuli that aren't visible to others, the disorganized movements, these are all consistent with psychosis. She may have believed someone was chasing her. She may have believed the elevator was unsafe or needed to be controlled. She may have been experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing voices telling her things that seemed urgently real. If that state continued or intensified, if she made her way to the roof while in the grip of delusion or disorganized thinking, then her actions there might have followed an internal logic that made sense to her in that moment, but appears incomprehensible to us. Perhaps she felt hot and believed the water tank offered relief. Perhaps she thought she was somewhere else entirely. Perhaps she climbed in thinking she could climb back out and found she couldn't. We will never know her thoughts in those final moments, and that is perhaps the saddest part of all. Mental illness is still stigmatized, still poorly understood, still underfunded in terms of treatment and research. And when someone with mental illness passes away, in circumstances that seem strange or preventable, there's a tendency to either blame the victim for not managing their condition better, or to ignore the mental illness entirely and search for external causes. Neither response is fair or useful. Elisa Lam was fighting a battle that not everyone could see. She was trying to live a full life, despite carrying a condition that made every day more difficult. Her decision to travel alone was brave, an assertion of independence and capability. That it ended tragically does not mean she was foolish or that she failed. It means that mental illness is a cruel and sometimes fatal condition, and our systems for helping people who struggle with it are inadequate. This is a good moment to pause and ask you for something. If this case has made you think, if it's challenged your assumptions or taught you something about mental health or safety or the importance of asking questions, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that button, join the community of people who believe these stories matter, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who works in hospitality and might think differently about guest welfare, someone who struggles with mental illness and needs to know they're not alone, someone who loves true crime but hasn't considered the human cost behind the mystery. Share it. These conversations matter. Now let's return to the question that haunts this case: what really happened? I've spent years with this file, and here's what I believe based on the evidence available. I think Elisa Lam was experiencing a severe psychiatric episode in the days before she vanished. I think her behavior in the elevator was the visible manifestation of internal chaos, of a mind that was no longer reliably interpreting reality. I think she left that elevator and, through some combination of accessible routes and failing security, made her way to the roof. I think she climbed up to one of the water tanks, though whether she used a ladder or found some other way up I cannot say with certainty. I think she opened the tank lid, which may have been easier than the hotel claimed if it was already partially open, or if adrenaline and mania gave her temporary strength. And I think she entered the water, perhaps seeking relief from perceived heat or threat, perhaps believing she was doing something entirely different in her disordered state, and then found herself unable to get back out. I think she drowned there, alone, while the city carried on around her, and I think the official ruling of accidental passing is likely correct, even if it's deeply unsatisfying. But here's what I also believe. This passing was preventable. A hotel operating in an area known for vulnerable populations should have better trained staff to recognize mental health crises. A building with open water tanks on the roof should have truly secure access, not just security claims that sound good on paper. A society that values human life should ensure that young people traveling alone have better support systems, better crisis resources, better ways to get help before tragedy occurs. The mystery isn't whether Elisa was taken by a person or a ghost. The mystery is why our systems failed her, why no one intervened when her behavior changed, why the hotel's security was inadequate, why mental health care is so difficult to maintain when you're away from home, why we're still having these conversations about institutional responsibility and duty of care. As for the elevator footage that started this whole obsession, here's something most people don't know. The version released to the public was edited. Not maliciously, but the timestamp was altered to remove gaps where nothing happened, making the door's open time seem even more unnatural than it actually was. This editing was done for practical reasons to shorten the video But it had the unintended effect of making the footage seem more supernatural than it was. And the door staying open, that can be explained by Elisa pressing multiple buttons, potentially including the door hold button, which would override the normal closing mechanism. It's not mysterious. It's just how elevators work when someone presses many buttons in rapid succession. But facts rarely satisfy the way mystery does. And so Elisa Lam's story has continued to grow, continued to be retold, continued to be packaged as entertainment on shows and podcasts and in the comments sections of videos like this one. I've contributed to that by making this video, and I recognize the ethical tension in that. I'm telling you this story because I believe it matters, because I think there are lessons here, because Elisa was a real person who deserves to be remembered as more than an internet mystery. But I also know that by telling it, I'm feeding the machine that turns tragedy into content. So let me be clear about what I hope you take from this. Elisa Lam was not a ghost story. She was not a conspiracy. She was a young woman with hopes and fears, and a medical condition that sometimes made the world a frightening place. She deserved better protection, better intervention, better care. Her family deserved better answers, better investigation, better closure than they received. And we, the audience consuming this story years later, deserve to understand the difference between mystery and tragedy, between what's unexplained and what's simply inadequately explained. The Cecil Hotel still stands, though it's been closed for years now, undergoing renovations that will likely erase whatever character, however dark, it once possessed. The water tank where Elisa was found has been replaced, the rooftop access presumably improved. The building will likely reopen someday with a new name, new management, new guests who may never know the full history of the place where they're sleeping. That's how we move on from tragedy in this country. We renovate, we rebrand, we forget. But some of us remember, some of us keep the files open, keep asking questions, keep insisting that these stories matter and that the people at their center deserve more than to become entertainment. Elisa Lam's passing was ruled accidental, but it was not acceptable. It was preventable. And every time we retell it, we should be asking not just what happened, but why, and how we might prevent it from happening again. Thank you for staying with me through this file. If it affected you, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if I got something wrong. Tell me if you knew Elisa, or someone like her, someone fighting battles the rest of us couldn't see. Tell me if you work in a hotel and whether this story changed how you think about guest safety. Tell me if you struggle with mental illness and what resources have helped you. Tell me if you're angry at how this case was handled, or if you think the investigators did the best they could with what they had. Just tell me something, because these conversations matter. And if you want more stories like this, stories that dig deeper than the headlines, that treat the people involved with respect and empathy, that ask the questions everyone else seems afraid to ask, then subscribe. Be one of the 100. Be part of something that values truth over sensation. This is Julian Cross, closing the file on Elisa Lam. But the questions remain open. They remain open because a building in downtown Los Angeles once held a secret for 18 days, while the world searched everywhere, except the place where the answer was hidden. They remain open because a young woman walked into an elevator and never walked out, and we're still trying to understand the invisible forces, whether neurological or systemic or both, that made that possible. They remain open because some stories resist closure, not because the facts are missing, but because the facts are too sad and too mundane and too reflective of our collective failures to satisfy our need for meaning. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember that behind every mystery is a person who deserves to be more than the puzzle they left behind.